When I was deciding which game I wanted to choose for my first video review, I wanted to choose a game that I liked and could explain why. It is interesting that even though Metal Gear Solid is as old as it is still approachable for an audience such as myself that is typically accustomed to modern game design conventions. Metal Gear Solid is often referred to as a pioneer of video game design by being one of the first titles to give a cinematic movie-like experience, and it has influenced games for many generations. For the time, although I cannot say from experience, Metal Gear Solid was a very innovative game in terms of game design and storytelling. The PS1 generation was filled with a lot of trial and error, which is what makes Metal Gear Solid stand out above many of the games released that generation for the things it does so well. Metal Gear Solid is a very well-designed game, and I would even argue that it still beats a majority of stealth-focused games that have come out in more modern console generations. Metal Gear Solid, and more in particular, its sequels have become a standard in quality and ambition that I hold that determines whether a game is fun for me. Welcome to my review of Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid was directed by the famous industry figure Hideo Kojima and was released for the PlayStation 1 in 1998. It is often regarded as one of the best games for that generation. What made it stick out was its alternative approach to the action genre and its focus on telling a complicated story with unexpected moments. Metal Gear Solid is a very iconic franchise filled with moments that is famous within the gaming community and is often referenced to this day. Although Metal Gear Solid 1 is quite low on my Metal Gear Solid tier list, it is still one of my favorite games I have ever played, just to give perspective on the sheer quality of this franchise. Metal Gear Solid 1 has some dated features and availability issues, however I still recommend it to anyone who holds an interest in game design and understanding the history behind it. I actually think Metal Gear Solid's approach to stealth is a better approach than games that incorporate stealth mechanics that have been released in more modern console generations because of this. This is terrifying. It's like a jump scare. Not only does it scare the player, it symbolizes what being caught in Metal Gear Solid means. The game is much harder to get through when the player gets caught. This is because Snake doesn't have unlimited ammo or a lot of health, so 90% of the time the player gets caught in Metal Gear Solid, they die, almost instantly. This is especially the case in the earlier parts of the game because the player does not have the tools or the health to deal with enemies in that way. The player is forced to conserve health and resources for the boss encounters that the player must face to continue on with the story. This incentivizes the player to think of ways to avoid enemy encounters as much as possible, which allows for some clever thinking from the player to avoid enemy encounters. This works in tandem with how uncommon finding ammo and rations are, because they're a genuine consequence for being caught in Metal Gear Solid. I think this is what makes stealth in games like Uncharted or Assassin's Creed as boring as it is, because the only consequence of being caught is the fact that you're going to have to brute force your way through the enemies instead, which in turn is the most effective and efficient way of combating enemies in these games, and is the approach that the game was designed to be taken in. The player is not incentivized to doing stealth because there's no compromise nor reward for taking down the enemies in this way. Particularly in Uncharted, Nathan Drake has so much ammo and health that the incorporation of stealth mechanics feels almost pointless. Progression in Metal Gear Solid is tied to the items that Snake finds lying around. Sometimes a specific weapon or item is required to get past a certain point in the game. For example, the player needs a remote-controlled missile launcher to get to Otacon's lab to watch a cutscene. However, how weapons and items are found in Metal Gear Solid is a very dated design choice, because the player isn't told where in the world the item is found. They either have to look around for items in the areas unlocked with their increasing level card key, or refer to a walkthrough to tell them where it is. There's one part where Snake is forced to leave a boss room mid-boss fight to walk all the way to the beginning of the game to get a weapon that can be used against the boss. I think this makes an interesting gameplay loop that incentivizes the player to explore and find items that will be helpful in the future. However, the age of the game really shows when the backtracking and long-distance walking disrupts the flow of the game. Sometimes a camera in the game screws you over because you can't see what's ahead of Snake unless you go into first person view. This is due to a limitation of the PS1 hardware in which they don't have analog sticks. So, unlike in the later entries where you can change the angle of the camera slightly, the player is stuck relying on the minimap to show where enemies are relative to Snake. The problem I have with this is that it causes the player to constantly look at the minimap of the game rather than the actual game, which is a design flaw that many games still suffer from. However, this game relies on the minimap so often that the areas where the minimap is disabled feels unfair due to the weird camera angle. I do think it's a fun and interesting idea to disable the minimap whenever the player is caught by an enemy NPC, because the player is so reliant on the minimap to see where the enemies are relative to them, it is natural to add a layer of punishment to being caught to incentivize the player to not get caught. The bosses in Metal Gear Solid have a cool variety that requires a range of approaches to beat. They are tense, fast-paced, and require a bit of thought from the player. I will admit that I found the final boss of the game to be a very challenging enemy, and I haven't actually beaten it. This is due to some data design decisions that I was ill-equipped in terms of rations and I could not beat it. I also accidentally pressed the exit button instead of the retry button when I was trying to fight it, subsequently losing like an hour of progress. The bosses aren't super challenging, however I could see why someone who had never played Metal Gear Solid before would struggle on them. Some of the controls and the design decision kind of feels dated, and sometimes frustrating. However, for the most part I got through every boss fight pretty easily on the second time around. I think the best way of playing Metal Gear Solid is the second and third times. This is because it takes some time to adapt to the dated controls, especially someone such as me who never played any older game other than a late PS3 title beforehand. The culture shock for playing a dated game is something that requires the player to get used to. I would argue that getting used to the dated parts about Metal Gear Solid is worth it for the experience of playing the game. However, I would understand if someone were to drop a game due to its dated qualities, because there are some games that I wanted to play but I couldn't derive any enjoyment from for that very reason. For those who have not played very many older games, playing Metal Gear Solid for the first time will require a walkthrough, which I would argue is a very tedious and boring way of playing any game. But nothing about this game is complicated, and once getting through it for the first time, the second playthrough seemed to be a much easier experience, even after a 3 or so year long hiatus from the game. One of the other qualities of Metal Gear Solid that one may argue is dated is obviously the visuals. However, I think Metal Gear Solid is one of the nicest looking, playing, and sounding games of the PS1 platform. Just a reminder that even though Metal Gear Solid looks like a low-poly paper sculpture, this is from a generation of games that look like this. Sure, low-poly visuals may be immersion breaking, however the way that they are used with cinematic techniques, combined with very good voice acting of the cast of Metal Gear Solid, the characters actually have a lot of personality despite their lack of physical expression.
But Snake, you're a hero, aren't you?
I'm just a man who's good at what he does, killing.
Metal Gear Solid has so many iconic moments, it's insane.
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
Sure, by today's standards, the voice acting is subpar, and some of the lines don't quite land.
We must not allow terrorists to get their hands on nuclear weapons of any kind.
But comparing it to what was available at the time...
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
Stop it! Don't open that door!
This was the cream of the crop, and it still holds up even today with some really emotional scenes.
Damn! Damn! I'm such a fool. It's all my fault.
Metal Gear Solid is renowned for having one of the most unnecessarily complicated stories in a video game ever, but I would personally consider it being one of the easiest to understand in the series, honestly. Personally, I think that it's what makes the story of Metal Gear Solid so good. I think understanding the puzzle of Metal Gear Solid's story is somewhat of a game of its own. The plot has so many moving parts with so many vague things that it took me 2 whole gameplays of the series to get the gist of what's happening in the first game. I don't want to be the guy that says new is good and old is bad, but now you don't see as many stupidly complex stories in video games as you used to. It's either a very basic premise of a hero and a villain, or a personal story about a relationship or a character. Metal Gear Solid has the themes of love and the feeling that one feels on the battlefield, while also being a political commentary about the purpose and implication of nuclear weapons, as well as the corruptions in politics, rather than telling another generic zombie survival story over and over again. Metal Gear Solid also tells its story through the codec. I think the system that is built around the codec is really interesting. Whenever the player gets stuck on a level of a game, they can call literally everyone on the codec to find something that could help them. Sometimes dialogue is made between characters that makes the player sit through a long codec call explaining exposition and backstories of the characters. Some may find listening to text like this boring, but I personally thought it was interesting and immersive to the story it was trying to tell. It is understandable that not every encounter between a couple characters can be a cinematic cutscene because they take more time to make than just writing text and drawing a couple frames to represent each character's speech, but there is a lot of talking in the game. I guess it's a given for a game that's directed by Hideo Kojima, but this game has more voice acting than games that are released in more modern consoles. Some games have the characters muted for side missions, but Metal Gear Solid has so many opportunities to speak, and all of it is voiced. 99% of the people who play the game will not hear all of the voice lines that the characters say over codec. Not hearing that and still getting the full experience of the game is something that only an interactive medium of entertainment could achieve. I think that talking on the codec at random times is a very clever way to build on characters and is even more well executed in the later games. Saving requires the player to call Mei Ling, which just adds to the immersion of the game. And you can't forget that whenever a player dies, the characters on the codec actually panic about Snake's death. It's subtle things like this that more games need to incorporate because it just adds that much more to their game. I do think that the music in Metal Gear Solid is cool as hell. Metal Gear Solid has a soundtrack that doesn't change that much throughout the entirety of the game, but has some subtle differences that really add to the immersion. It has an atmospheric way of using instruments that tie into the environment well. The cavern theme has some clashing sounds and a monotone beat backed with a hum that really portrays an atmosphere of a cold, dark area in which Snake is sneaking in. Also, later in the game, the same basic style is used to give much more emphasis on the vocals to give Rex's lair a more high-risk atmosphere. But the most iconic song in Metal Gear Solid must be the music that is played when Snake is caught. I think it captures that adrenaline rush, high-risk, fast-paced feeling, and it sounds really cool. In conclusion, I like Metal Gear Solid. It's a game that I found to be one of my favorites despite its age. Hideo Kojima has such an interesting imagination that even with his older titles and his weaker ones, that there is so much to talk about and discuss, which is why I would consider myself a fan of his. With a growing number of a younger audience in the gaming communities, they may see their favorite 30-plus-year-old YouTubers praise these older games from the N64 or PS1 eras being some of the best games of all time. After try it out, they may find out that they actually control like complete garbage and look like something that would be played in a bowling alley. This is a generational difference. They're used to design conventions that have been developed after the 40 or so years of game design that has been taken place. However, they won't understand what makes retro games so good. I think, especially for those who are interested in game design, or just in the industry as a whole, that understanding the origin of game design is important. However, that takes commitment to do, and definitely a willingness to adapt to the generational differences. Some may argue that Metal Gear Solid is not actually as dated as most titles. For those who are interested in retro games, Metal Gear Solid is a good place to start. If you don't actually care about older games, I still think Metal Gear Solid is a game worth playing because it makes the other games in the franchise a little easier to understand. Metal Gear Solid 3 being considered one of the best games of all time, and I would agree. This ties with the greatest problem about the Metal Gear Solid and a majority of its franchise, which is its availability. I don't know what business strategy Konami, the licensor and publisher of Metal Gear Solid, is following, but it's very hard to play a majority of the Metal Gear Solid franchise. I don't know how hard it would be to port them to Steam for a quick buck, but for footage in this video, I played a fan port for Metal Gear Solid for PC. However, this port is filled with graphical bugs and some cutscenes don't work. You could try using an emulator, but I normally have a tough time with them, but you can try. Otherwise, you can play it on the PS Vita if you have one of those. However, I came across a bug where it asked me to insert game disc 2, like into the Vita? Like, what? I also think it's worth mentioning that there's a remake for Metal Gear Solid called Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, which is a retelling of the story with the same cast, just remade for the Nintendo GameCube, and tweaks some aspects in the game design. I think rather than it being a replacement for Metal Gear Solid, it's a completely different experience to be had, and I personally prefer the original. I aspire to do game design in the future, and if I make a game that caused some 17-year-old in this room in the middle of nowhere to write a video essay on how good it is, I would consider it a success. Thanks so much for getting to the end of my video. I worked really hard on it and I've been wanting to do this for the longest time, but I haven't had the time. But since the virus came out and I lost my job, I thought I might as well give it a shot. I hope you enjoyed it. There are a bunch of other games that I want to talk about, including some of the sequels of Metal Gear Solid, so I hopefully once I make them, you'll check them out. I have a lot to say on a whole bunch of other games too. This was a test run and it was really fun. Again, Thanks for watching.